make. Many of you are participants in the YES conference. Many of you are leaders of Jewish life and scholars who've been invited particularly for this discussion. We represent a collaboration between the Atlantic Council, the YES conference, and the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, an international organization that works to promote dialogue between the Ukrainian and Jewish communities, between Israel and Ukraine. And one of the sort of complex issues related to Ukraine is the issue of anti-Semitism. It's complicated because there is an issue of memory politics, there is an issue of the activity of far-right groups in Ukraine, there is the issue of Russian propaganda. All those things come together and create, I would say, various narratives. Ukraine is a paradoxical country. The two last chiefs of staff of the president of Ukraine, the current one and the previous one, are of Jewish origins. One of them, Boris Loshkin, has just taken over as the leader of one of the major Jewish organizations here, the Jewish Confederation of Ukraine. The prime minister is of Jewish extraction. There's a lively and large Jewish community here of approximately 150,000 or more. There's an active dialogue with Israel. At the same time, there are anti-Semitic tropes. There are issues of the past and of memory that have not been addressed. And I think we have an excellent group of people who can help us understand, separate the wheat from the chaff and get a better understanding of where Ukraine stands. Some of you may know that in 2016, the Pew Charitable Trust, a reputable polling and foundation that deals with the values of democracy and so on, did an international poll in Central and Eastern Europe, which asked a simple question. Do you want Jews as citizens of your country? And countries like Romania and Armenia and Russia had 15 to 20 to 30% of people saying that no, Jews are not, in their view, welcome as citizens of their countries. Lithuania, unfortunately, was also fairly high in that poll. Ukraine stood at 5%, which was the lowest of all the countries that were polled in this region, which extended from, as I say, Central Europe to Southern and Southeastern Europe, all the way through to the former Soviet space. So paradoxical issues. At the same time, we sometimes see media speaking of nighttime torchlight parades with people aggressively chanting slogans of the of ultra-nationalist with ultra-nationalist content. There is the operation of far-right groups here, and so all these things we're going to try to unpack in an informal discussion with very wise people. Let me say how we're going to proceed. Mr. Likhachev will be our first speaker and will address both. He's produced major reports on anti-Semitic incidents on a regular basis, an annual basis in Ukraine. He produces these. He is also a scholar who produced a fundamental report on far-right groups that Freedom House published, an organization I once used to head, but am not affiliated with anymore. Bernard-Henri Levy needs very little introduction as a public intellectual who has dealt with the Jewish spirit, Jewish life, and anti-Semitism all his life as moral and philosophical questions and political problems that confront Europe, and a very close friend of Ukraine with intimate knowledge of life in Ukraine. Berel Rodal is my colleague in the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter and has been very active in memory politics and in addressing the issues of understanding the history of Jewish life. Some of our publications, which are the fruit of his work and his wife's work and of our organizations, are out there for you. There are books on Babin Yar, there are books on the history of Jewish life, There's an encyclopedic book on Jews and Ukrainians. We have Vladyslav Davidzon, who is also an editor of the Odessa Review, but a frequent writer, a writer and a columnist for the Tablet and for other publications, a public intellectual who has lived in Odessa, who has lived in Ukraine for a number of years, is an American who brings a certain understanding and sensitivity and is engaged in the debates on the state of Jewish life and of anti-Semitism in Ukraine, and we're grateful for him. And we have John Herbst, a colleague who is the director of the Eurasia program of the Atlantic Council, a colleague of mine at the Atlantic Council, the head of all the things that are done with Ukraine for the Atlantic Council, former ambassador here, who also has been leading the drive to understand Russian propaganda through a number of projects that the Atlantic Council does. So it's a great group. We have a limited amount of time. We want time for not so much a convivial discussion because we're discussing complex issues, but for a relaxed discussion, a more informal rather than academic discussion. But I think we'll begin with about 10 or 12 minutes from my colleague who will speak about his research and findings into both the right and the state of anti-Semitism. We'll then proceed to Bernard-Henri Levy, who will speak more broadly about his understanding of Jewish life here, memory questions, anti-Semitism in Ukraine, and broad trends of anti-Semitism in Europe and where Ukraine fits in on this issue. And then we'll move on to John Herbst to give us the global picture of how Russian propaganda has tried to engage this issue. And then we'll have Vlad Davidzon speak about his experience and follow with Berel Rodal to speak about his understanding of how Ukraine addresses memory issues, how Ukraine is performing on its responsibilities to its Jewish citizenry, as well as to the memory of the millions of lives that perished in the Holocaust on this soil. So perhaps you can begin.
Thank you, Adrian. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here with you today. Yesterday I returned from Warsaw, where HDM, the central meeting on human rights and civil liberties organized by OSCE, is going right now. And I have heard a speech of one representative of formerly friends know the name, and he in his speech told about the rise of anti-Semitism in Ukraine. Even he had numbers of percent of how this level is bigger now than it was in previous year. And the fact is that his NGO is not NGO. His organization has a direct financial support from Russian budget. We call such organizations GONGO, governmental operated, non-governmental organizations. And he is one of the elements of a wide network of Russian propagandistic structures all over the world. And anti-Semitism is extremely important point and extremely important direction for the Russian propaganda. This propaganda was maybe more important 4 years ago, in the very beginning of the Russian aggression, and if we analyze this element in official speeches of high-level Russian officials, including President, we will see how anti-Semitism was important in their propaganda about Russian aggression against Ukraine. In official speech for the Russian parliament after the annexation of Crimean Peninsula, Vladimir Putin told that The factors which made possible the aggression were the new power, the new de facto government in Kyiv, who are neo-Nazi, Russophobic, and anti-Semitic ones. An official statement of Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs the day after Russian paramilitary groups taking control over Slavyansk and Kramatorsk in April 2014, Russian Foreign Ministry told that it was an answer for the repressions against everyone who was disagree with an official policy of Kyiv de facto government and against anti-Semitism. In any kind of official comments about Russian aggression against Ukraine, Russian officials every time speaks about anti-Semitism as one of 2 or 3 most important topics. And there is an interesting question why anti-Semitism became so important for Russian propaganda. But I think the most important question is why this direction of propaganda was so effective. I communicate with Western or Israeli journalists every week, twice a week, and every time when they call me, they ask me about anti-Semitism in Ukraine. I work on monitoring of anti-Semitism in Ukraine more than 15 years. I'm the person who knows the real numbers, the real incidents, and I know that, for example, during last 2 years, there were no one registered issues of anti-Semitic direct violence, physical violence against persons. Of course, there were incidents of anti-Semitic vandalism, of anti-Semitic hate speech, but no one issue of anti-Semitic violence during last 2 years. And if you compare this fact with the situation in Western European countries or even in the United States, you will see that any kind of statements about rise of anti-Semitism in Ukraine is just senseless. It's nonsense. Yes, we had some dark times, and even 10 years ago, there were much more issues of anti-Semitic violence, but now we have the situation where the number of issues is 0. So why Western audience is ready to believe in speeches about rise of anti-Semitism in Ukraine? I think there are several factors. First of all, of course, historical stereotypes and historical memory of the Jewish people. Second is a kind of intellectual laziness, where stereotypic mentality is just enough and you don't need to know a real situation to have a feeling of understanding the situation. And Russian propaganda, of course, one of these factors. And as far as we know now, for example, from Manafort's evidence, he was one of the advisors during Yanukovych presidency, it was his idea to create an anti-Semitic image of the Ukrainian opposition even before the beginning of Maidan protest. During the Revolution of Dignity, those claims about anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic character of the Ukrainian national democratic forces became a mainstream of Ukrainian governmental control media and Kremlin control media, of course, all over the world. And so now we are in a situation where we have 2 different realities. Reality which we have in the streets of our cities, where people in Orthodox Jewish dress code are free to move without any danger, and the reality of media, including Western media, which is much more about character of Kremlin Russia propaganda about Ukraine than about a real situation in Ukraine. I don't know what about the time. I think I close to finish.
You can continue. I mean, one of the things that you also have done is a report on the far right. So separate from the issue of anti-Semitism is the existence of far-right political movements and formations that you have studied intensively. Maybe you could say a few things about them, their relative strength, their potential, and how they interact with this narrative, and also their positions on the issue of the Jewish minority and of the Jewish memory.
For my next topic, I just wasn't sure if I have enough time. Ukrainian radical right ultranationalistic organizations are extremely active during last years, and in the new context, in the context of Russian aggression, they changed their image in eyes of society, in eyes of public. For public opinion now, they are defenders of the Ukrainian independence and territorial integrity and sovereignty. And 5 years ago, they were just an aggressive youth, a social subculture. But now, for large part of the society, they are maybe not heroes, but they have found their legitimate place in a public and political sphere. And this context is totally different from one we had 5 years ago. But for people, it is normal now to understand that some, I don't know, speaker on a public meeting is a representative of one of the radical nationalistic groups, but the society is not ready to support them on electoral way. As far as we know from sociological reviews, as far as we have seen in the elections in 2014, their electoral support is not enough to pass the electoral barrier and to create a fraction in a parliament. Again, the situation was totally different 6 years ago when Svoboda, the most serious radical nationalistic party, had more than 10% of voters in the elections. So this new context is very dynamic. There are different trends and different possible directions for our society, and the most serious question which will format the political and social context for nearest year is the Russian aggression. About a few words and last words about anti-Semitism in ideology and propaganda of contemporary Ukrainian radical right. Of course, some of them are anti-Semites. Some of them no. But the most important subject is that they don't need any kind of conspirological enemy. They have a real enemy. And their struggle with this enemy is a basis for their popularity and for their legitimacy in eyes of society. So anti-Semitism is not on agenda. Anti-Semitism is not phobia number one for them, even if they are xenophobic according to their views.
Thank you. Our next speaker, and I ask Berel Levy, who has traveled to Ukraine regularly, who was on the Maidan, who saw the solidarity of Jewish activists with ethnically Ukrainian activists, all of them Ukrainian, saw the multinational kind of character of those protests and has seen the evolution of this country at first hand over the last 5 years and well before that, and has the experience of thinking about and understanding the phenomenon of anti-Semitism in a range of societies, established democracies and the like. Might you give us your wisdom, sir?
Yes, thank you, Adrian. It's true that when I came in Ukraine for the first time on the Maidan in February 2014, and when I was given the great honor to address the crowd on the Maidan in February and then again in March, this question of anti-Semitism was very present to my mind. I knew through my readings, I knew through my conversations with Emmanuel Levinas, I knew from the work of Father Patrick Desbois that Ukraine had been a fatherland of new anti-Semitism. I knew that very, very well. I knew that it had been a mass grave for Jews. I knew that as everyone perfectly well. I remembered when I first came on the Maidan, I had in my memory a conversation with Elie Wiesel a few weeks before. It was 2 years, 3 years before he died, about Ukraine, and with Claude Lanzmann, another of my friends. For both of them, there were two countries which had been hit by the plague of anti-Semitism, apart from Germany, of course, which was Poland and Ukraine. So I had that in mind. And again, when I brought in Paris the then candidate Petro Poroshenko to see President Hollande in beginning of March 2014, same. I was obsessed by this question of Ukrainian anti-Semitism. I knew how strong it had been and how vibrant it had been. I knew how the nationalist trend in Ukraine had a lot to deal with anti-Semitism. I knew all the ambiguities, not to say more, of the Bandera movement, for example. I knew how in certain cities of the west of Ukraine, Nazis had been welcomed with applause during the war. This is the first thing. Second thing, when I came to Ukraine more, I saw how slow and how hardly begun was the work of memory. The work of memory is always very difficult. We French know it took us 30 years to start understanding that the French people had been deeply and strongly anti-Semitic. It's very difficult to see face to face the ghosts of your past. I mean, us French people. But in Ukraine, I was struck by the unwillingness, sometimes, often, to look that in the eyes. I remember in Lvov, in 2015, maybe 16, I was so surprised when I spoke with intellectuals of the city of Lviv, not by their anti-Semitism, no, you are right, it was not on the agenda, but struck by their absence of awareness of what had happened. I remember the Golden Synagogue of Lviv, reduced to a sort of big hall with all the neighbors in the neighboring streets, not really knowing that there had been one of the most magnificent synagogues of Central Europe. I remember the Lysitsky forest, which is where tens of thousands of Jewish bodies were buried without ceremony, and people coming, normal, average Ukrainian, coming to picnic as if nothing. So this is my second remark. Due to the communism, the decades of communism, due to the difficulty in general for French, for Germans, for everyone, for the Arab countries, did not even start their work of mourning and of memory. The work in Ukraine was very slow to start. Number three, what struck me immediately when I was in the Maidan, when I met Ukrainian friends, or women and men becoming friends, is to what extent, as my friend Zizel told me the first time we met, anti-Semitism had been strangely deactivated. This was your word when we first met in Ukraine. I was so surprised on the Maidan to see, I was there for many times. I spoke 2 times, but I went more. I never heard one anti-Semitic slogan. I never saw one anti-Semitic graffiti. In this sort of great and noble Hyde Park corner of Ukraine, where every possible word was speakable and was possible, you had great things which were said, you had also less great things, but there was one thing which was not uttered, pronounced, which was the anti-Semitism. This was very, very striking. The absence in this moment of freedom of speech of anti-Semitism. In my country, when you have absolute freedom of speech, you inevitably have anti-Semitic outcome. In America, same. And generally, you can be sure that those who protest against the absence of right of saying everything, they regret the right to express anti-Semitism. It goes together. Those who shout against censorship, political correctness, what is this country where you cannot say everything? Generally, it means where you cannot say anti-Jewish jokes and so on. In Ukraine, on the Maidan, then in all my reportage in Ukraine, then in Kramatorsk, where I went, I asked, I tried, I listened. This did not come. This was very, very surprising. Number four, it happened that last year or 1.5 years ago, I was in charge 2 years ago by my president, the French president, to represent him the day of the commemoration of the deaths of Babi Yar. A lot of you were there also, I know. I recognize some of you. It was a very moving moment, of course, as all these moments of mourning, and I delivered a little speech in the name of France. And again, I listened, I observed, I tried to touch the materiality of the emotion around me. And I was again very surprised by the weight of emotion, by the amount of sensitivity, by the quality of the mourning of the Ukrainian representatives, official, semi-official, I don't really know who was there. There was maybe 2,000 people, I suppose representative of this country, and there was such a quality of listening, of hearing, such a pious, a worshipper attention, that I was really nearly as moved by that than by the souvenir and the ghosts of the dead. I had in front of me a country or a part of a country who had this past of darkness, who had been prevented to really face it, and who nevertheless considered it with this mix of respect, of fear, and of sense of self-guiltiness, which is one of the signs of the nobility of a people. I felt that in Babi Yar. Again, the same year, I was with this young gentleman. We went to Uman. No, why do you laugh? It's not laughable. Yeah, not laughable at all. For me, it was really moving to, first of all, to be there in this great place of Jewish thought, close to the grave of Nachman of Vladyslav. It was very moving to be part of this Jewish crowd celebrating the Rav. But what impressed me most was the dignity of the Ukrainian people around. And I can tell you, I say it, I hope there is somebody of France here, because I really, if not, I will convey what I'm going to say. An Uman event is not thinkable in France. In France, a French village, where every year at Rosh Hashanah, a huge Jewish attendance, and not Jewish attendance of normal sort, really Hasid, dancing, singing, making a lot of noise, having the loud ceremony. And there were thousands, 30,000, in a village of maybe a city of maybe 5,000, something like that. Okay. And apart, except a few incidents, except a few, not even incidents, there was nothing, there was something which was reported this year, but there was no problem, no protest, no feeling that these Ukrainians of ethnic, they were not disturbed. And there was again a sense of welcoming, a sense of responsibility, a sense of understanding of this Jewish ceremony by the non-Jewish Ukrainian, which was for a people struck by this calamity, having had not the right to mourn it, which was remarkable. I was really struck by this Uman experience, as I have been by the Babi Yar one. And to conclude, my last remark will be to say that, of course, I see all this quarrel of history between, which is part, as I said this afternoon, in the war which has been launched by Russia against Ukraine. There is a big part of conflicts of narratives and the accusation of anti-Semitism thrown to the Ukrainians. Honestly, till the moment I was blacklisted and forbidden to enter in Russian territory 3 years ago, I went in Russia often also. Now I am on the blacklist of Mr. Putin, which is a badge of honor for me, by the way. I am forbidden of entry. But till then, I went in Russia a lot because I like Russia. I have friends. I have devoted a big part of my life to the support of the dissidents, of Sakharov, Solzhenitsyn, and so on. I have kept a lot of friends. And honestly, if I had to do the morbid comparison between anti-Semitism in Russia and in Ukraine, between the presence of the anti-Semitic ghost in the Russian ideology and in the Ukrainian, I fear that the winner of the bad competition, the winner in the hall of shame of anti-Semitism is not Ukraine, is certainly the Russia of Vladimir Putin, who is so attacking and disdaining Ukraine on this topic. So all this is a complex history. It's a big picture. A lot has to be done, a lot more, of course. And President Poroshenko did a lot. I hope the next president, even if it is Petro Poroshenko, as I hope, will do much more. But honestly, a lot has been done already. This is what I want to say modestly, according to my personal experience. And then I will have to leave, not because it is Shabbat, but because I am tired. You know that it's a debate on anti-Semitism on the Shabbat night. I don't know how to interpret it, but it's a fact. Thank you, Adrian.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much for joining us. I think your wisdom will resonate in your absence and will still be a part of our discussion, so you are free to leave. You know, it's a complicated way to kind of get all. We have different people have different experiences and different knowledge base. But John Herbst, maybe you can say a little bit about, in general, the Russian propaganda war against Ukraine, the Russian disinformation. We're not, you know, let's all understand. We're not saying that anti-Semitism is not a problem in Ukraine. We're not saying that memory issues are not all perfectly, that they are all perfectly addressed. There are a lot of challenges, but I think we need to separate the wheat from the chaff, as I had said earlier, between what is real, which is serious, but has a scale and a scope, and what is in the Russian narrative about the fascist junta, about the neo-Nazis, and about anti-Semitism in this.
Thanks, Adrian. I will say some things which may seem rather simple in order to frame the discussion about anti-Semitism, the charges of anti-Semitism in Ukraine. Kremlin activities here, including promoting the notion that Ukraine is rife with extreme nationalists, Nazis, and anti-Semites, comes from the very political objectives that the Kremlin has set for itself in Ukraine. Long story short, those of an imperial mind set in Moscow, and that's certainly true of Mr. Putin, and the power ministries, the FSB, the GRU, the Ministry of the Interior, understand that for Russia to function as an empire, which is very much what they want, for Mr. Putin to regather the quote-unquote Russian lands as Tsars Ivan III and Ivan IV did, they need to start with Ukraine. And it's worth recalling that the current crisis we're in, which has seen 4+ years of Russian war, Kremlin war against Ukraine, began in the crisis precipitated by Ukraine refusing to walk away from a trade agreement with the European Union and refusing to join the Eurasian Union, a so-called Kremlin economic project, which is really a political project designed to ensure Kremlin control throughout Eurasia. Once Ukraine made that choice, once the Euromaidan happened, and as the result of an effort by then-President Yanukovych, encouraged by the Kremlin, to stop the rebellion of the Ukrainian people by sniper fire, by blood, the Kremlin had a government in Ukraine that was bound and determined to establish a real democracy, which of course we don't see in Mr. Putin's Russia, to establish an open society and a market economy, and to orient itself towards Europe, towards what we can say without shame, the free world. From that point forward, Mr. Putin's objective was to undermine the government of Ukraine. Now, you can describe the unpleasantness in Ukraine, meaning the Kremlin aggression, the unpleasantness in Georgia, meaning Kremlin aggression, provocations in the Baltic states coming from Moscow, as a result of the fact that Moscow lacks something very important. It lacks soft power, the ability to attract people into its realm of activities. Since they want the influence and are unable to attract, they have to use other methods. You might call it the methods associated with what we Americans call a 2x4, which is a block of wood which can be used either to construct a building or to slam someone over the head. And the Kremlin has gotten very good, and it's had decades and centuries of practice of applying a 2x4. And in its 21st century variation, this is called hybrid war, which is using a whole spectrum of tools from disinformation and bribery on the least unpleasant end, to assassinations and subversion, to actual war. And all these tools have been applied against Ukraine over the past. And the question of anti-Semitism arises in this context. It's part of Moscow's information war on Ukraine. Now, as our three other speakers have pointed out, what I'm saying in no way suggests that there's no anti-Semitism in Ukraine. But what the three speakers before me have made clear is that the problem of anti-Semitism in Ukraine is actually a rather small one compared to many of its neighbors, compared to most of the world where anti-Semitism is measured. So the Kremlin promotes the notion of raging anti-Semitism in Ukraine and raging ultra-nationalism in Ukraine by tried and true methods. And what are those methods? It starts out with a simple lie, or if not a lie, an exaggeration which turns into a lie. And if you go back, for example, and watch how the Soviets spread the notion that AIDS was concocted by the American military in order to subdue nations around the world, you see how this works. So it starts by the planting of this lie in some obscure media source which is very reliable from a Kremlin point of view. And whether in Soviet times or in Mr. Putin's Russia, Moscow cultivates journalists around the world, including in major media, and journalists that they cultivate, perhaps after this story first appears today in a small website or some local paper, is picked up by a regional paper, and therefore achieves a certain measure of audience, certain audience. Then, of course, the next stage is to have people begin to talk about it and encourage journalists in major media, whether that's newspapers, whether that's television, whether that's radio, to pick it up. And sometimes this happens via, again, methods that were cultivated, particularly in communist regimes, including the Russian communist regime. The practice of creative photoshopping, where you take a picture, you remove something from the picture, you add something to the picture. We saw a lot of that, as mentioned by Mr. Likhachev, during the Euromaidan. Clearly, at that time, there were many real pictures of impassioned demonstrators. So what's a Russian apparatchik to do but take one of those pictures and instead of a poster, I don't know, or an EU flag, to substitute an ultra-nationalist symbol or an anti-Semitic or an ultra-nationalist slogan, and then to spread that around. And then it gets picked up in ways I've already described. It gets picked up such that, and also it relies upon experiences or historical memory going back to a time when anti-Semitism was a problem in these territories. And what gets lost in all this is the fact that, as Bernard-Henri Levy mentioned, quoting Joseph Zissels, that whatever anti-Semitism existed here kind of went away. I mean, not entirely, but largely, and as a social phenomenon of any power. So you have the extraordinary polling that Mr. Likhachev cited. I just want to make one more point to underscore again how the propaganda apparatus promoting fake news, I don't like the word, I don't like the phrase fake news because it has other connotations, but promoting disinformation works. It doesn't involve anti-Semitism, but it does involve, unfortunately, another area where ethnic tensions are rising. And in this case, it's Polish-Ukrainian relations. And by the way, another great story about independent Ukraine has been the, again, disappearance of such tensions up until a couple of years ago. And the renewal of these tensions really, the story of this renewal do not begin on the Ukrainian side of the border. But let me give you an important example which Adrian and I had the opportunity to learn about firsthand. There was a bombing at the Polish consulate in Levy around a year ago, actually more than a year ago. Unclear who did it, but within hours of this event, there were quote-unquote ethnic Poles of Ukrainian citizenship demonstrating in the streets of Lviv. This incident, both the bombing of course was picked up by media, major media very quickly around the world, but the news of the demonstration were picked up on a small website, again, reliable to the Kremlin, then picked up by local media, and then picked up by larger media. What became clear as the dust settled was that the gentleman leading this was an ethnic Ukrainian from Lviv who happened to speak not very good Polish. And what was also apparent as people got to look at this was that the scores of demonstrators, we're not talking about hundreds, that were responding to advertisements which offered a small honorarium for participating in this demonstration of outrage against anti-Polish sentiment in that part of Ukraine. So this is the way this works. And fortunately, the games on the Ukrainian-Polish front have not received as much traction as the games on the anti-Semitic front. But close examination of the anti-Semitic memes demonstrate that there's not a real there. And the final point, which should actually need not to be said, but sadly it needs to be said, and not so much in Kyiv, but more likely in Washington or in Paris or in Berlin or in Brussels, is that the folks who are bringing you the notion that anti-Semitism is a major problem in Ukraine are the folks who are unable to condemn the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And that should be something that we should all understand.
Vladyslav Davidzon, as an American who has planted roots in Ukraine and in Europe, and is a major writer on these topics for the tablet and for other influential Jewish and other publications, is frequently engaged in explaining and interpreting events that are discussed in the Jewish community about processes in Ukraine that relate to anti-Semitism, to Jewish life, and so on. So maybe you could talk to us about your experience both living here, understanding the phenomenon of Jewish life in Ukraine, and also your dialogue with fellow Jews, Jewish reporters, and intellectuals on the state of Jewish life and anti-Semitism.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. Thank you for inviting me. Great pleasure to be with my friends, Berel and Bernard Henry, who's a good friend, but now that he's gone, I'm going to say something that I would not have if he was sitting next to me, is that, and I often say this to Americans, and I often say this to British people when I talk at conferences or in synagogues. If my pal Bernard was here, I would not have said this, but I feel more comfortable wearing a kippah in Odessa and Kyiv than I do next to my apartment in Paris, and certainly when I studied in Brussels in my early 20s, I would not walk through downtown Brussels in my yarmulke, and that is just a fact. This country absolutely does not have organized anti-Semitism. I will say some maybe a little bit more critical things towards the end, but let's start with the pleasant things. I've lived in Odessa and I've lived in Kyiv. My wife is a Jewish girl from Odessa. I have ancestry in Chernowitz. I write for Tablet, which is a liberal publication. It's probably the most influential Jewish magazine in the American Jewish world. It's liberal with a big L, sometimes classically liberal, sometimes leans center-right. We have intense debates with my colleagues in the leftist media, both secular and Jewish, about these things. And these arguments, at least in America, and certainly in Britain now, break down along axioms of left and right. I have taken some of my colleagues at the Forward, for example, to task for publishing complete nonsense. That nonsense comes from three vectors: clueless leftists, malicious people, and to me the most painful, Jews who, like me, were born in the Soviet Union, who have Russophone culture, who have not been back here for 25, 30 years, who emigrated maybe in 1989 or 1992, who have deeply painful memories of what happened, that was passed down to them through their grandmothers and their grandfathers, and who do not have any contemporary information, who do not actually know what's going on here, and write op-eds. That to me is it's a stab in the heart for someone who lives here, who feels connected to the Ukrainian Jewish community, and who is a Jew in Ukraine rather than Ukrainian Jew, but parsing the differences. When it's Israelis writing these pieces, a little bit more media criticism, it's because they actually just they're very scrupulous and rigorous on stuff that goes on in Israel, but they're not always keen on the facts, and they just don't know what's going on outside of Israel. Point case, in fact, there was a piece in Haaretz 2 months ago, and there was a major scandal, and then we found out it was just probably Max Blumenthal, who's a hardcore anti-Zionist, I think an anti-Semite. Sidney Blumenthal's son wrote basically a clip job piece putting together all the bad news from Ukraine that had happened in the last 5 years, and he made an op-ed out of it. It was just grotesque, and was published without any kind of double-checking by Israeli editors who would never in a million years publish something as clueless about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There's just a lack of expertise, and there's a lack of interest, and there's just a lack of understanding of these issues. And my Israeli colleagues, when I asked them, how does Haaretz just publish Max Blumenthal without saying that he just copied it and edited this stuff off of other people's pieces as basically a Dadaist hit job? It had nothing to do with Ukraine, actually. It had to do with internal American politics having to do with Israel, right? And my Israeli colleagues say to me, well, we don't actually always know what's going on in Ukraine or Russia, and there is this thing which is prevalent in Jewish communities in the West about the lands that Ukrainians came from, Ukrainian Jews and Russian Jews and American Jews came from. Is a lack of understanding. So that's the media criticism. I can do more of that if you want later in the Q&A. About Ukrainian politics, obviously everyone likes to say this is a country with a Jewish prime minister. That's true. It's a country with dozens of Jews in parliament. Some of them talk about it, some of them are more discreet about it, but there are dozens of Jews in this country who are members of parliament. And that's fine, and I think everyone knows and no one cares. There are Ukrainian Jewish oligarchs, some of them who are quite unpleasant, also tolerated. You know, I think that says a lot for this country. My friend Bernard and I went to Uman right after this very conference in 2015. He's absolutely right, and he wrote about it in his book, Virginia's Judaism. That would not be tolerated in most places. If you were in, it's mystical, beautiful dancing, and mystical, beautiful dancing is not something we tolerate in post-industrial societies. You're not supposed to do that. The behavior that's going on right now in the Boryspil airport would not be tolerated in the Tel Aviv airport or in the JFK airport. It just wouldn't be. You know, that's beautiful, but it's true. After the Maidan, the only politician in this country who tried to shore up her flagging ratings with weaponized anti-Semitism to get uneducated people who don't know much to vote for her was a member of parliament who's now sitting in jail for trying to blow up parliament with mortars. I translated her prison memoirs. I wasn't, you know, in retrospect, maybe Bernard and I should not have put that much effort into Ms. Savchenko's rehabilitation campaign when she was a prisoner of conscience in Russia. That campaign, does everyone know what Nadia Savchenko did, by the way, with all her anti-Semitic comments? It was stupid, it was flagrantly stupid. She doubled down, insulting several other MPs of Jewish descent and calling several other politicians who are not of Jewish descent or thought to be of Jewish descent, that's unproven or it's propaganda or whatever. She called them anti-Semitic things on television, and she also made anti-Russian and anti-Polish slurs on television, which is, of course, we would all agree, not nice. It backfired on her spectacularly. She did not get the ratings that she wanted. The embassies and the civil society and the international elites turned away from her. And I think she understood that it was not a good decision. And lots of other people who would have thought about doing something like that maybe before elections took note of that Ukrainians did not go in for that kind of thing. Neither did your Western allies. I think that's a very good sign that the one person who tried it got pie on her face. It says a lot about Ukraine. Two unpleasant things. This country does have a problem now with the Roma. I've written op-eds about that. This country does need to extend the sort of protections and assurances that it has extended to the Ukrainian Jewish community, to the Roma. And of course, the memory politics of this country is complex. I've been attacked personally for it by my colleagues. Some very unpleasant people on the far left have attacked me, and some people on the far right have attacked me, which is always a good thing, probably. Also, the memory politics is very complex. I'll let my friend Berel talk about that whenever you're allowed. Okay. Thank you so much, Adrian.
Thank you. So before my colleague Berel Rodal addresses this issue, one other theme that had created a lot of consternation and debate and coverage in Israeli and Jewish media was the spate of namings of streets for Ukrainian nationalist leaders, for Stepan Bandera and others, that occurred last year. And yes, thousands of streets were named by people the Jewish community will never accept as acceptable political figures and a reminder of complex positions taken by them. They're linked to anti-Semitic ideas in the 1930s. Their cooperation or collaboration, at least at some points, with the Abwehr and the Nazi regime, and later their extermination by that same regime. But a complex history never however acceptable to the Jewish community. But what was lacking in all of these discussions was the understanding that there was a broad decommunization of names, which was opening up tens of thousands of streets and squares and boulevards all around the country, and that this was not the majority trend. It looked like a trend where the country was moving in this direction of acknowledging leaders unacceptable to Jewish memory, but without this contextualization. So it also created a lot of distress and a lot of, I think, harm to Ukraine, but also harm to the general understanding of where the society is. At the same time, also the fact that Ukraine, the place not where necessarily Ukraine is responsible for the 2 million Jewish souls that were buried in the earth of this country, but that there has been very little and sort of a snail's pace of proper memorialization of these killing fields and grave sites. That also is an issue that looms large in Jewish life. Again, Yosef Zissels, who is mentioned by many, is involved in the memorialization of many of these places. Our organization is doing some things in a modest way in Sambir and other places. And there is this grand project of a Babin Yar Memorial and Research Center. All of these are, and efforts, I think, in Lviv in recent times, efforts by activists both of the Jewish diaspora and with some Ukrainian Jewish and Ukrainian help in Lviv Oblast, Rohatyn, and other places to memorialize and understand Jewish life and to give dignity to those who died, who had dignity but were not given the dignity of memory. All that, these are processes that are gaining some momentum but are definitely not adequate and remain an issue. And so we have a person who is in the middle of all these issues, Berel Rodal, who is the chairman of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter's advisory board, a former advisor to Canadian prime ministers on areas unrelated to this, but whose wife is a major scholar of issues that relate to Jewish life and to the period of the Second World War. Berel, let's turn it over to you.
I will, given the hour, I'll focus on action. Anti-Semitism is perhaps one of the original cases of information warfare, going back a very long way. Poisoning the wells, whatever it is, it goes back a very long way, and it's a theme which is used from time immemorial by people to mobilize populations, whatever. We won't talk about that, except to say that how you measure anti-Semitism is not so simple. You think in terms of incidents, and Ukraine is way down the list of places where there are such incidents. But it's not only incidents that need to be measured, but also people's attitudes and concepts. More difficult. So you have classical measurements. Do you think Jews have too much influence? Do you think Jews control the media? That does, if you say yes to all of that, it's a classical badge, identifier, marker of having anti-Semitic tendencies, but it can mean the opposite. For the Japanese, who heard the Germans tell them about how Jews control the world, and that was bad, they said, maybe we need to go along with them. And in Ukraine, it's much more the case. It seems to me that when someone thinks Jews have a lot of influence, it's not a matter of saying, then we must fight these people. It's, let's learn from them. Let's work with them. Especially if you think of those people as your neighbors and co-citizens. So I want to talk about what should be done, what needs to be done. And there is work that does need to be done. For one thing, let's talk about what people don't, we talked about Russia and Russia's problem with an independent Ukraine that is making its own choice. And in the Russian mind and that of others, Jews are important. Jews are seen to have an important role in American politics, in shaping opinion, and in the financial world. So it's a central asset to be played. And they play it. And they play it. So what should Ukraine do? Apart from saying, Canard, it's not what you say it is, there are positive things that Ukraine ought to do, not only to counter vicious propaganda and to protect itself, but because it needs to be done. So one of our project, I'm now speaking about the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, and we have many members here, I'm glad to say, of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter team. Adrian and I are co-founders, along with Berel Rodal and Jim Termody, our chairman, and we have here the members of the team, Natalia Fedoshak and Vladimir Krunevich Jr., who heads our Kyiv office and who's been enormously helpful. I'm not missing anyone. And members of the advisory board, all great, including Vlad Sr., and Ludmila doesn't need an official position. These are all very important people in shining a bright light on the 1,000 years and more history of Jewish life together with ethnic Ukrainians on this territory, the territory that is today modern Ukraine. So when we think of the difficult days of the 20th century, difficult days that affected many populations, we have to bear in mind and keep in perspective the 1,000 years of common history. This territory is the territory on which Hasidism was born, a fundamental movement in Jewish religious life. And I should have begun these comments by wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom. This is the Jewish Sabbath. There's no harm in celebrating it together with friends in the way we are. Even if I'm using a microphone. But I didn't activate it. The territory of Ukraine is also the birthplace of Yiddish literature and of Hebrew literature, a central place in the birth of what is today Zionism. So it's important to remember and commemorate all of that when one is thinking about the relationship. I arrived in Kyiv, whatever it was, on Wednesday. There were 4 flights in baggage claim. Those are the only flights in to Borispol. All 4 were from Tel Aviv. That tells you something. That's extraordinary. So, at the same time, there are no pages in Ukraine's museums at the regional level and at the national level that tell you the story of Jewish life on this, in this land. They don't tell you the story of not just Jewish life, but of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, of the life lived together. So one of our major projects is to tell that story, not for us to tell that story, but to enable Ukraine's museum directors to tell that history to their own populations. Why is that history absent? I credit the Soviet Union with that. In the Soviet Union, there's no history. There's only the creation of Homo Sovieticus, and that was the work that was to be done. Well, that work needs to be undone, and what Alti and I, working with Vlad and others, in a fantastic trip here a few weeks ago only, visited 13, 14 places. We were regional museums, and in every case there was a strong interest expressed by the directors and the assistant directors. The directors were what you would expect. The assistant directors were all marvelous women who are actually doing all the work. It's a new Ukraine. It's a young country, and they all want that story to be told. So, to the degree appropriate, we will undertake the task of helping those museum directors tell that story to their own populations, employ local historians and archivists to help that story to be told, and that story will include work in the National Historical Museum in Kyiv. So it's a dramatic thing, and available here in both English and French versions is a catalog, exhibit catalog that tells the story of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter over the centuries.
Berel,
I hope we have enough copies.
Please explain that you were joking about the
Sorry?
You said French version.
No, did I say French? Yeah. Oh, sorry, my Canadianism is coming out. It's in English and Ukrainian versions, published this week. I don't know, however many...
Too much time in Ottawa, doing politically correct.
However many copies we have, we are making available to you here and now. I think it's a marvelous work. Natalka, who played an important role in producing it, might agree. I say this not only because it was written by my wife, who is Adrian's co-director, but that's the work we do. The work we do is to enable a historically accurate, but also empathetic and comprehensive story of the relationship. The great majority of Jews alive in the world today, of Ashkenazi origin, derive from this territory and this land. They don't know that. There is a lot of ignorance about the relationship. There are many stereotypes. Stereotypes are also views, incorrect views, that people have of themselves, not just of the other. So there's a lot of work to be done. It's important to do that work. And I cannot leave this without making an observation, which I apologize if anybody's hurt by this, but when people I was with visit Babyn Yar, the territory, and they're very impressed by Kyiv, which is a beautiful city. Many more people from anywhere, but in particular Israel and the Jewish world, should come here and visit it. But when they come to Babyn Yar, they get very upset when they see this is a territory that houses many peoples who suffered. That offends people. That's a way of avoiding truth. That's a way of relativizing and ignoring reality. So something has to be done to fix it, because it's very damaging when people come and see that. Now, there's been a lot of resistance to getting anything done. Something must be done to commemorate and properly tell the story in a way that avoids nonsense on the territory of Babyn Yar. I understand, and I won't go into this, but it's too political an issue, and it needs to be resolved. So there's work to be done. I want to leave this particular intervention focusing on the need for action. We're building on the platform of an evolving society. Israel and Ukraine are the homes of two historic peoples living for millennia under alien rule, who are now forming modern identities in newly independent states. Both countries are still learning the arts of self-government. They have much more in common than people realize. And I would like to see closer relations and lessons learning one from the other, and a proper respect and commemoration of history is very important for both.
Thank you, Berel. You are a very nobly patient audience. We've been here for a very long time, but on the other hand, we have a lot of wisdom around these tables, so maybe I'll allow for a couple comments of a minute or two that could enliven the discussion from anyone who feels the urge or feels confident enough to wade into the discussion. Please, Mr. Zinger, is a pleasure.
After 50 years of rules of Karl Marx in Lithuania, I can use the micro. So, my name is Emanuel Zingris. I'm a founder of Jewish Museum and former president of recreated Jewish Cultural Society in 1990s, and part of our liberation movement. Until now, I'm in Parliament and chairing the commission to investigate crimes. So, Ukraine get a possibility to be free, liberated from Soviet and after that Russian captivities, and we listen to the voice of Ukrainian politicians, what they will say, leaders, what they will say about former nation who possess other language, Yiddish and Hebrew, and was a treasure of this country for the last 700 years. So, in my country, I will give you a few examples. Mr. Brazauskas, together with me and Prime Minister Kirkilas, visited in 95 Knesset, and he told, we collaborated. 94% of Lithuanian Jewish people were killed. My mother survived in a concentration camp. No one person from my mother's school, who was European school, and Lithuania was free country, Western country, and have education in French and German languages in middle schools, gymnasiums, noble education. No one former school friend shake my mother hand after German army invaded. From 35 schoolmates, school friends, school, so 5 were Jewish, 30 Lithuanians. No one were saying hello to my mother after 41. Only one teacher of history came in front of the column and say sorry. So we have what to do after becoming free. The sense of freedom in my country is to be self-critical. So to be self-critical means to measure understanding of the other people who were part of our life before Second World War, even if they use other languages and they were other nations under one sky, other ethnicities. In this case, of course, Jewish. So from your side, we are looking to your Institute of History of in Kyiv here, and we are trying to understand the country's maturity is, of course, related to not only to the numbers of Jewish members of parliament. I'm only one Jewish member of parliament in Lithuania for the last few decades, but about the level of understanding of sadness, what happened. So, from my point of view, the commission, if you will settle here a commission, is commissioned from prominent world-level historians, like Timothy Snyder, other guys, okay. Not important, Polish world-level historians, American world-level historians, Ukrainian world-level historians, and finally settled some point after point the most painful issues about collaboration with Nazis, and of course giving back all those machinery of Russian propaganda, who is propaganda of war, and everyone understands that Russians are using countless number of agents trying to put down Ukraine, including the first propaganda against about anti-Semitism in Ukraine. That's clear. So from our side is we are counting of the not only about the future museum, who should be in Babi Yar, absolutely, and the museums in countryside, who is extremely important, and having better Halitsky airport name in Lvov, not Bandera, that is Halitsky name of airport in Lviv. They choose Halitsky name instead of Bandera in Lviv about 10 years ago. But having proper final summaries by the top-level intellectual community about painful past with phrases, paragraphs, and common sense, Polish, German, American, and Ukrainian consensus among top-level historians. I would like to have such world-level commission while your country deserves, and we are all fighting for your independence against Russia aggression, and we're supporting you totally. But we need some step forward in this level of Western self-screening, self-understanding, and self-evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I make a comment? And it's just a matter of nuance that often is missing also on the Jewish side. Approximately 5 million non-Jewish Ukrainians perished either fighting the Nazis or at the hands of the Nazis because of the war and the occupation, civilian and so on. There is the legacy of the Holodomor, another 4 million, what Timothy Snyder calls the bloodlands. So there is a lot of mayhem and death in the earth of Ukraine, Jewish and non-Jewish. And one of the problems that I see from the outside is not insensitivity, but a kind of that the non-Jewish Ukrainian community has not had its pain properly articulated. And it's a common project. And I think that the important thing would be to help not to compare the two events, because they were the war was very different. The extermination of the Jews was a unique event. The Holodomor was a terrible event, but it was not capable of the entire extermination of the nation, nor was the Nazi policy towards non-Jews their complete extermination. So, understanding that, nevertheless, it's important for Ukraine to have its memory examined broadly, and I think that it would create compassion rather than contestation between different narratives. But I think from the point of view of the Jewish community, there should be an understanding that when the Russian propaganda says neo-Nazis, well, this is a country that has family memories of practically every family that was, or wide territories of great-grandfathers, grandfathers, uncles, and so on, perishing in different ways at the hands of the occupying power. And so that understanding seems to be absent. I think it actually inoculates Ukraine from pro-Nazi ideas, except on the political fringes. We have time maybe for, do you want to say something, Berel? But just very briefly, and we'll have time for one more comment.
Adrian is very wise. Is this working? But for example, YIVO will be mounting, with our support, the institute. It's the home of study and understanding of East European Jewish culture. It is now in New York. It is now in New York. It moved from Vilna just before the war. So there will be a major conference there on the Holodomor. That's in a Jewish institution in New York. That's the kind of thing we think it worth supporting. So there is a famous sage named Hillel who observed 3 questions. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when then? That's important. So everything Adrian has just said is critical to what we try to do with the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter Initiative. To tell our stories, and our motto is, our stories are incomplete without each other. And I will only add that the stories of this terrible previous century, very important and neuralgic, but there's a long history, 2,000 years of history, and we need to be aware of that history as well.
Thank you, Berel. One last comment, please.
Yeah, it's a comment. Well, my name is Lisa, and I was executive director of the music performance at that 75th anniversary of the Babi Yar tragedy. It was a performance called Witness, devoted to commemoration of that tragedy, and I just want to share a couple of things that I observed after we did that campaign. After that, I studied abroad, and I was telling my foreign friends about what we did, that we remember about that we start doing more things on creating that memory in Ukraine. And they were almost all of them asking, why are you doing that if you're not Jewish? I've never had that question here. And that's something I wanted to share after I've heard your comments and your speeches today. That's something, I didn't really realize it here, because we just did it because that's something that is important, because we care. But no one asked me here why. Abroad in the West, in Oxford, in the UK, in Switzerland quite recently, at a peace building conference, I spoke about Babi Yar and that performance, and I've got like dozens of questions about that. It's very interesting.
Thank you, thank you. I think we really have tested your strength and will, but I hope you appreciated the quality of the discussion, the sort of the relaxed atmosphere in discussing difficult issues. And I want to thank all of you for coming. And if you have any interest in what the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter does, there is swag, as they say, there is literature and so on, if you wish it. We don't insist on it, But thank you for coming, and thank you to Yes for allowing us to have this discussion of another of the dimensions that were discussed at length of the disinformation wars that Ukraine faces and the West and the democratic world faces from outside. Thank you again.